Gallatin Valley, Montana Territory. October 1878. While his neighbors raced against the coming cold to raise log walls skyward, one man did something that made them question his sanity. Lars Eriksson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd spent 2 seasons trapping in these mountains, began digging downward into the earth itself. "He's building a grave, not a home," muttered Thomas Bradley, a master carpenter from Pennsylvania who'd constructed 17 cabins across the territory. Bradley watched from horseback as Eriksson's shovel bit into the rocky soil, hour after hour, day after day. The hole grew deeper, 4 feet, then 5, then 6 feet below ground level. Other settlers gathered at the ridge above Eriksson's claim, shaking their heads. They'd seen men lose their minds to isolation before. This looked like another case. "No Christian man lives underground," declared Margaret Hoffman, whose husband had just finished chinked a fine 2-story cabin with a stone chimney. "That's how animals live." But Eriksson kept digging. And as October gave way to November, as the first snow dusted the peaks above them, a question hung in the cold air. What did this strange Norwegian understand about surviving Montana winters that 17 experienced builders had missed? If you want to discover the exact engineering principles that turned mockery into mastery, that transformed underground madness into frontier wisdom, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, because the knowledge that kept Eriksson alive at 30 below zero might save your life someday. We're about to reveal thermal engineering secrets that modern homes have completely forgotten. The ridicule began the moment Eriksson explained his plan at the October Trading Post gathering. 23 families had assembled to coordinate winter preparations, share seed stock, and discuss cabin designs. When Eriksson described his intention to build a turf shelter, what Norwegians called a torvus, the room went silent. Then the laughter started. "You're going to live in a dirt hole?" Bradley's voice carried across the assembled crowd. "Lars, I built structures from Ohio to Oregon. Wood expands and contracts at predictable rates. Stone holds its form. But dirt? Dirt collapses. Dirt floods. Dirt breeds disease." He turned to the other settlers. "I've seen mine shafts cave in on experienced engineers. And he wants to sleep under 6 feet of prairie." Samuel Guthrie, who'd survived 3 Dakota winters, leaned forward. "Lars, I respect your people's old country ways. But this isn't Norway. Montana cold will kill you dead if your shelter fails. A log cabin with proper chinking and a good firebox. That's proven technology. Why risk your life on some ancient method?" Eriksson remained calm. He'd anticipated this resistance. "Because," he said quietly, "I've seen these shelters maintain warmth for days after the fire dies. Because my grandfather's torvus in Valdres stood for 80 years through winters that made Montana look mild. And because Earth doesn't burn." The room erupted in arguments. Hoffman insisted that Christian families deserved walls they could hang portraits on, not dirt they'd brush from their hair each morning. Bradley calculated aloud that the labor required to excavate and roof a proper underground structure would exceed the time needed to raise log walls by at least 40%. "You'll be racing against winter," he warned, "and you'll lose." But Eriksson had already done his mathematics. A log cabin required cutting, hauling, and fitting between 80 and 120 logs depending on size. Each log needed to be notched, stacked, chinked with moss or clay, and sealed against wind penetration. Then came the roof, heavy timber beams, split shakes, and waterproofing. The work was immense. His turf shelter required different labor, but less total material transport. The earth was already there. What he needed to excavate, he'd used to build. The roof timbers would be shorter, requiring smaller trees. The walls would be thick, but thick with mass that cost nothing but sweat. "You'll freeze," Bradley said flatly as the meeting dispersed. "And when you do, don't come begging at my door for mercy." Eriksson smiled politely. "I won't need to." That smile, that quiet certainty in the face of unanimous opposition, made Bradley furious. Over the next 2 weeks, as Eriksson's excavation deepened, Bradley made it his personal mission to document the Norwegians' folly. He rode past the claim daily, counting shovel loads, estimating depth, shaking his head at each new foot of excavation. 6 feet down now, Bradley announced at the trading post on November 1st. He's dug himself a perfect grave. All he needs is someone to fill it in come spring. But the settlers who laughed hadn't asked the right question. They hadn't wondered why Erickson spent 3 full days selecting the exact location for his excavation, testing soil composition, measuring drainage angles, calculating the position relative to prevailing winds. They hadn't noticed the precision with which he cut the earth walls at a slight backward slope, or the careful way he compacted the floor in layers, or the specific southwest orientation of his entrance tunnel. They saw a man digging a hole. Erickson was engineering a thermal battery that would absorb summer heat and release it slowly through winter's darkest months. He was building a structure that worked with the Earth's natural temperature regulation instead of fighting against it. The difference between those two perspectives would become brutally clear in exactly 63 days. By mid-November, Erickson's excavation measured 16 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. But the real engineering began above ground level. While his neighbors assumed he'd simply throw logs across the hole and pile dirt on top, Erickson's design was far more sophisticated. He began with the walls. The excavated earth hadn't been discarded. Erickson had carefully separated it into 3 piles: clay-rich soil, loamy topsoil, and prairie sod with its dense root systems intact. Now he used each strategically. First, he cut sod blocks exactly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. Each block weighed approximately 30 pounds and contained a matrix of grass roots that held it together like natural rebar. He stacked these blocks around the perimeter of his excavation, building upward from the floor level. 2 rows thick. The wall rose 3 feet above ground level, creating a structure that was 9 feet tall total. 6 below ground, 3 above. What good is a wall made of grass? Bradley scoffed when he rode past. First hard rain will melt it back to mud. But Erickson wasn't building with grass. He was building with thermal mass. Each sod block, once stacked and compressed under its own weight, would stabilize into a dense barrier approximately 8 inches thick per layer, 16 inches total for his double wall design. The root systems would knit together within weeks, creating structural integrity that rivaled mortared stone. And that 16-inch thickness would hold heat the way Bradley's 6-inch log walls never could. The physics were straightforward, though none of his critics understood them. Heat moves through materials at different rates, depending on their thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity. Seasoned pine logs, the standard cabin material, conduct heat relatively quickly. Warmth generated inside escapes rapidly to the cold exterior. Earth, by contrast, has both low thermal conductivity and high specific heat capacity. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Erickson was building a structure that wouldn't just resist cold penetration. It would store warmth like a battery and discharge it gradually over hours or even days. Next came the roof structure. He'd cut 9 pine logs, each only 8 inches in diameter and 14 feet long, far smaller than the massive 20 to 30-foot timbers required for a traditional cabin. He positioned these across the shorter span of his excavation at 18-inch intervals, creating a strong but lightweight roof frame. Across these, he laid smaller branches in a tight lattice, then a layer of birch bark for waterproofing. Then came the crucial layer, 8 inches of clay-rich soil, carefully packed and graded to shed water away from the center. This wasn't random backfill. Erickson shaped it precisely, creating a dome that would channel rainfall to the edges while adding massive thermal mass above the living space. Finally, he laid sod blocks across the entire roof surface, grass side up. The roots would continue growing, binding the structure together and preventing erosion. Within 1 season, the roof would be indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie, covered in native grasses that added both camouflage and additional insulation. The total thermal mass of the structure was staggering. Approximately 8,400 pounds of earth in the walls alone, plus another 6,000 pounds in the roof layer. Nearly 7 tons of material that would stabilize at the Earth's natural temperature, roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, at 6 feet depth in Montana's climate and resist rapid temperature swings in either direction. For the entrance, Erickson dug a tunnel angled downward at 15 degrees, extending 8 feet before reaching the main chamber. This wasn't merely an entrance, it was a cold trap. Dense, frigid air would settle in the lower tunnel section rather than flooding the living space. Warm air, being lighter, would remain in the main chamber. The entrance faced southwest, away from prevailing northern winds, with a wooden door recessed 3 feet into the tunnel to create an insulating air gap. Inside the main chamber, Erickson built a small firebox using river stones, positioned against the north wall. The firebox measured only 18 inches square, a fraction of the size typical cabin fireplaces required, because the space it needed to heat was so much smaller and so heavily insulated. The chimney was a simple stone and clay column extending through the roof, capped with a flat stone to prevent downdrafts. On November 28th, as the first serious cold front approached, Erickson moved his supplies underground. His neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They expected to dig him out come spring. Frozen, they assumed, when his foolish shelter proved unable to sustain human life through Montana's brutal winter. What none of them understood was that Erickson had just completed a structure that maintained 50-degree base temperature without any heat input whatsoever, purely through thermal mass stabilization and earth coupling. Every BTU he added with his small fire would be captured by those 7 tons of earth and released gradually over 12 to 16 hours. His neighbors' log cabins, by contrast, would heat quickly when fires blazed but lose that warmth within 2 to 3 hours after the flames died. They'd chosen structures that fought against the environment. Erickson had chosen a structure that worked with it. The difference would become unmistakable in exactly 15 days. December 13th, 1878. The barometer at Fort Ellis dropped faster than the post commander had ever recorded. By evening, the temperature had fallen to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was 4 below zero. By dawn on December 14th, it had reached 18 below, and the wind was rising. The blizzard struck with such violence that Thomas Bradley later described it in his journal as nature's fury personified. Wind speeds exceeded 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the valley, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. The temperature continued falling throughout the day. By evening of the 14th, it had reached 29 degrees below zero. Several cabin thermometers stopped working. Their mercury contracted beyond measurement range. In the traditional log cabins scattered across the valley, families huddled around roaring fires. Bradley's journal entry from December 14th recorded his experience, feeding the fire constantly, burning through wood at nearly double normal rate. Despite maintaining flames throughout the day, cold penetrates every gap between logs. Ice forming on interior walls away from the hearth. Margaret, wrapped in every blanket we own, cannot maintain adequate warmth beyond 6 feet from firebox. Estimate we've burned through more than 100 pounds of wood since midnight. At this rate, our winter supply will be exhausted by February. The Hoffmans, in their fine 2-story cabin, fared worse. The upper floor was uninhabitable. Heat rose, but escaped too rapidly through the roof. They'd abandoned those rooms entirely, crowding into the ground floor around their large stone fireplace. Their consumption exceeded 150 pounds of wood per day during the cold snap. Samuel Guthrie, the Dakota veteran, had prepared better than most. His smaller cabin design and carefully chinked walls kept his family relatively comfortable. But even he wrote, burning wood constantly. Can feel the cold pressing against the walls. This is survival, not comfort. Thank God we harvested enough fuel. If you're watching this and thinking about your own survival strategy, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what happened next proves that bigger fires and more wood aren't always the answer. Sometimes the answer is working with the earth instead of fighting against it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether you'd trust your life to underground shelter or traditional construction. Meanwhile, 6 feet underground, Lars Erickson was warm. Not survival warm. Not huddled under blankets barely adequate warm. Actually, genuinely comfortable. His small firebox, burning less than 40 pounds of wood per day, maintained an interior temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit. When he woke on the morning of December 14th, the fire had been out for 7 hours, yet his thermometer read 52 degrees. The thermal mass was doing exactly what he'd engineered it to do. Those 7 tons of earth surrounding his living space had absorbed heat gradually over the previous weeks. Now, as exterior temperatures plummeted, that stored heat released slowly into the interior. The temperature differential between his chamber and the frozen world above was more than 80 degrees. Yet the earth walls conducted heat so slowly that his space cooled less than 6 degrees over 7 hours without any fire at all. When Erickson did light his small fire, using carefully split pine and efficient burning techniques, the temperature rose to 58 degrees within 90 minutes and stabilized there. The earth absorbed the heat, preventing overheating, and would release it gradually once the fire died. His neighbors, by contrast, experienced wild temperature swings. Bradley's cabin interior ranged from 75 degrees near the fire to 45 degrees in the corners, a 30-degree variation within a single room. And when the fire diminished, even slightly, the temperature dropped rapidly. The thin log walls, with their low thermal mass, couldn't store heat. They were mere barriers, not batteries. The blizzard continued through December 15th. The temperature never rose above 22 below zero. Winds continued at 35 to 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill far lower. It was, local records later confirmed, one of the worst cold snaps in Montana Territory history. On December 16th, as the storm finally began to ease, Samuel Guthrie made his way to Erickson's claim. He'd come partly out of concern. Surely the Norwegian had frozen, but also out of curiosity about the body recovery process. What he found stunned him. Smoke rising steadily from the grass-covered mound. The entrance tunnel clear and accessible. And when Erickson emerged in response to Guthrie's call, he was wearing a single wool shirt and looking utterly comfortable. "You survived," Guthrie said, the statement halfway between question and accusation. Erickson smiled. "I was never in danger. Come inside. I'll show you why." What Guthrie saw in the next 15 minutes would change everything he thought he knew about frontier construction. And within a week, his account would reach every settler family in the valley, including Thomas Bradley, whose certainty was about to be replaced with something far less comfortable: doubt. Samuel Guthrie descended the entrance tunnel expecting cold, darkness, and desperate conditions. Instead, he found himself in a space that felt like a mild spring evening. The contrast was so stark that he stopped 3 steps inside, certain his senses were deceiving him. 58 degrees, Erickson said, gesturing to a mercury thermometer mounted on the wall. "It was 52 when I woke this morning. The fire's been burning for about 2 hours. Guthrie stared at the instrument. Outside, the temperature was still 12 below zero. That meant a 70-degree difference between interior and exterior, maintained with a fire so small he could cover it with one hand. "How much have you burned?" Guthrie asked. "Since the storm started?" Erickson gestured to his remaining fuel pile, neatly stacked against the rear wall. "Approximately 120 pounds over 3 days. 40 pounds per day, averaged." Guthrie did the mental calculation instantly. He burned nearly 300 pounds over the same period, maintaining temperatures barely adequate for survival. Bradley, with his larger cabin, had likely burned 400 pounds or more. The Hoffmans, with their 2-story structure, might have exceeded 500. Erickson was achieving equal or better comfort using 1/3 the fuel, and doing so in conditions that should have been impossible. "Show me," Guthrie said quietly. "Show me how this works." Erickson gestured to the earthen walls surrounding them. "Touch them." "Go ahead." Guthrie placed his palm against the sod blocks. They were cool, but not cold, perhaps 45 degrees, he estimated. Certainly warmer than the frozen exterior world. "That's the Earth's natural temperature at this depth," Erickson explained. In summer, when surface temperatures reach 90 degrees, the Earth 6 feet down stays around 50. In winter, when surface temperatures drop below zero, the Earth at this depth stays around 45 to 50. The ground itself maintained stability. He moved to the wall nearest the firebox. Now, touch here. Guthrie placed his hand against the earthen surface near the heat source. It was warm, perhaps 60 degrees. The earth absorbs heat slowly, Erickson continued. These walls contain roughly 7 tons of material. When I light my fire, that mass begins absorbing thermal energy. It takes hours to fully charge, but once charged, it releases that heat back into the space gradually over the next 12 to 16 hours. It's like a battery, storing energy and discharging it slowly. He gestured to the small firebox. This fire produces perhaps 6,000 BTUs per hour when burning. In a traditional cabin with thin walls, most of that heat escapes rapidly to the outside. The logs conduct heat quickly, and air gaps between them allow convective losses. You're constantly fighting heat loss. Erickson pointed to his thick earthen walls. Here, the heat has nowhere to go quickly. The Earth's low thermal conductivity means it takes hours for warmth to migrate outward through 16 inches of packed sod. And because the walls have such high thermal mass, they absorb heat instead of letting it escape. The structure itself becomes a heat storage medium. Guthrie was beginning to understand. So you're not just heating air, you're heating the walls themselves. Exactly. And those walls then radiate heat back into the space long after the fire dies. Last night, I let the fire go out around 10 o'clock. When I woke at 5 this morning, the temperature had dropped only 6 degrees in 7 hours. In a log cabin, the temperature would have dropped 30 degrees or more over the same period. Guthrie ran the calculations mentally. If Erickson's numbers were accurate, and the thermometer on the wall suggested they were, the thermal mass approach was roughly 4 to 5 times more efficient than traditional log construction in terms of fuel consumption per degree of warmth maintained. What about moisture? Guthrie asked. Everyone says earth walls will weep and rot. Erickson pointed to the tunnel entrance. That's why the entrance angles downward. Cold air, which holds less moisture, sinks into the tunnel. Warm air, which rises, stays in the main chamber. The temperature gradient creates natural air circulation that prevents moisture accumulation. And the sod roof sheds water away from the center. I graded it specifically for drainage. He gestured around the space. Feel the walls throughout the room. They're dry. The temperature stays stable enough that you don't get condensation. In a log cabin, you get ice forming on interior walls because the surface temperature drops below the dew point. Here, the thermal mass prevents those extreme temperature differences. Guthrie spent another 30 minutes examining every detail of the structure. The stone firebox positioning, the chimney design, the roof construction, the precise way Erickson had cut and stacked the sod blocks. Nothing was random. Every element served a specific thermal or structural purpose. When he finally emerged into the bitter cold of late afternoon, Guthrie had made a decision. He needed to tell the other settlers what he'd seen, and he needed to acknowledge something difficult. He'd been wrong. They'd all been wrong. The Norwegian they'd mocked as a fool had just demonstrated engineering principles that completely overturned their assumptions about frontier construction. He'd proven that bigger wasn't better, that more wood wasn't the answer, and that ancient techniques contained wisdom modern builders have forgotten. By December 20th, when the temperature finally climbed back above zero, Guthrie's account had reached 14 families across the valley. The reactions varied. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Some accused Erickson of trickery. Perhaps he'd burned far more wood than claimed. But Thomas Bradley's reaction was different. Bradley didn't dismiss or accuse. He simply rode out to Erickson's claim on December 21st, descended the entrance tunnel without announcement, and spent 2 hours measuring, calculating, and questioning. When he emerged, his face was drawn. He mounted his horse without speaking and rode back toward his cabin, where his depleted woodpile and his family's cold-bitten discomfort awaited him. Bradley's journal entry from that evening contained only 8 words. I was wrong. The Norwegian was right. Thomas Bradley's admission, quiet, private, written only in his personal journal, would have remained hidden if not for what happened next. On December 27th, another cold front swept through the valley. Not as severe as the mid-month blizzard, but sustained. Temperatures remained below 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 consecutive days, with nighttime lows reaching 15 below. By January 2nd, 1879, 5 families in the valley had exhausted their winter wood supplies. They'd calculated reserves based on typical Montana winters, not accounting for the exceptional cold and their own structure's inefficiency. The Hoffmans were burning furniture to maintain minimal warmth. 2 other families had abandoned their cabins entirely, crowding into neighbors' homes and sharing resources. Samuel Guthrie made a proposal at the emergency January 5th gathering at the trading post. We need to learn from what works. Lars has proven his design. We should be studying it, not ignoring it. The suggestion met resistance. Margaret Hoffman spoke for many when she said, "I will not live in a hole in the ground like some animal. My family deserves dignity." But dignity meant nothing to frozen children. And as January wore on, practical necessity overrode pride. On January 18th, Thomas Bradley appeared at Ericsson's entrance tunnel. The master carpenter carried measuring tools, paper, and pencil. "I need to understand the exact specifications," he said simply. "Will you teach me?" Ericsson welcomed him inside. Over the next 4 hours, Bradley measured every dimension: wall thickness, roof grade, entrance tunnel angle, firebox size and position, chimney diameter. He calculated thermal mass. He examined sod block construction techniques. He asked about drainage, about moisture management, about seasonal temperature variations. Bradley took 43 pages of notes. When he finally emerged, he told Ericsson, "I'm going to build one, a proper one, following your design. And I'm going to document the process so others can do the same." Word spread rapidly. By late January, 6 families had approached Ericsson requesting instruction. Some wanted to build supplementary turf shelters to reduce wood consumption in their existing cabins. Others, like Bradley, wanted to construct proper underground dwellings for the following winter. Ericsson agreed to help, but with conditions. This isn't just digging a hole and throwing dirt on top, he emphasized at a February meeting attended by 19 settlers. Every element serves a purpose. The depth, the wall thickness, the entrance angle, the roof construction, these aren't arbitrary. They're engineered. He spent the remainder of that winter teaching. On days when weather permitted, small groups gathered at his shelter. He explained thermal mass principles. He demonstrated proper sod cutting techniques, the correct depth to preserve root systems, the optimal dimensions for structural stability. He taught them to read soil composition, to identify clay-rich earth suitable for walls versus loamy soil better used for roofing. By March, when the worst of winter finally broke, Thomas Bradley had drafted construction plans incorporating Ericsson's design principles. His drawings showed 3 different sizes: a small single-person shelter, 12 feet by 10 feet, a family dwelling, 16 feet by 12 feet, matching Ericsson's, and a larger structure, 20 feet by 14 feet, for bigger families. Bradley's reputation as a master carpenter gave the designs credibility that Ericsson, as a foreign newcomer, had lacked. When Bradley publicly acknowledged that earthen construction, properly executed, demonstrates superior thermal efficiency compared to traditional log structures in extreme cold climates, settlers listened. The spring and summer of 1879 saw an explosion of turf shelter construction across the valley. Some families built them as winter retreats, maintaining their traditional cabins for summer use. Others, convinced by the fuel efficiency and thermal performance, built turf shelters as primary dwellings. By October 1879, 17 turf shelters stood within a 50-mile radius of Ericsson's original structure. Each incorporated his core principles: 6-foot depth, double-thickness sod walls, properly graded roofs, downward-angled entrance tunnels. Some builders added their own innovations: larger dimensions for extended families, stone-reinforced walls for added durability, multiple chamber designs for storage separation. Samuel Guthrie built what became known as the Guthrie Hybrid, a small log cabin for summer living connected by a covered passage to an underground turf shelter for winter. Best of both worlds, he explained: light and ventilation in warm months, thermal efficiency in cold months. The Hoffmans, initially the most resistant, finally relented in August 1879. They didn't abandon their two-story cabin, but they constructed a turf shelter 50 feet away. When winter returned in November, they grudgingly admitted the underground structure was surprisingly comfortable and reduced their wood consumption by more than 60%. Even families who didn't build their own turf shelters modified their log cabins based on Erickson's principles. They increased wall thickness by adding earthen berms against exterior logs. They partially buried structures to take advantage of ground temperature stability. They redesigned fireboxes to be smaller and more efficient, focusing on thermal mass rather than raw heat output. The cultural shift was profound. In less than 12 months, living underground had transformed from an object of mockery to a mark of frontier wisdom. Visitors to the valley noted with surprise that some of the most prosperous, respected families lived in earthen dwellings that were nearly invisible from a distance, blending seamlessly with the prairie landscape. If you're amazed by how quickly proven engineering can overcome cultural prejudice, hit that like button and subscribe right now. We're about to reveal why this ancient knowledge matters even more today than it did in 1879. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you'd consider underground construction for your own property. In February 1880, a journalist from the Helena Independent visited the valley to investigate reports of the underground settlement. His article, published March 7, 1880, described the turf shelters as dwellings that challenge our assumptions about civilization and comfort. He noted particularly the irony that structures dismissed as primitive 1 year prior to now represent the most advanced thermal engineering in the territory. But perhaps the most telling validation came from an unexpected source. In November 1880, Fort Ellis, the nearby military installation, began construction of 3 turf shelters for winter sentinel posts. Military engineers, after analyzing fuel consumption data and temperature records from the valley settlers, concluded that earthen construction provided superior performance for sustained cold weather occupation. The man they consulted for design specifications? Lars Ericsson, the Norwegian immigrant whose sanity had been questioned just 2 years earlier now advised the United States Army on frontier construction. The transformation was complete. Mockery had become mastery, and the ancient knowledge Ericsson had carried from his grandfather's valley in Norway had proven itself in Montana's harshest conditions. Lars Ericsson's turf shelter represented far more than one man's survival strategy. It was a living connection to thousands of years of human engineering wisdom that industrial societies had largely forgotten. The tradition of underground and earth-sheltered dwellings extends across cultures and continents. In Iceland, turf houses, called torfbær, housed the majority of the population until the early 20th century. These structures, built with stone foundations and thick sod walls similar to Ericsson's design, demonstrated remarkable longevity. Some Icelandic turf houses built in the 1700s remained continuously inhabited until the 1960s, surviving 250 years of North Atlantic winters. The engineering principles were nearly identical to what Ericsson employed in Montana. Thick earthen walls for thermal mass, grass-covered roofs for insulation and waterproofing, strategic positioning to take advantage of natural landforms for wind protection. Small, efficient heating systems that worked with, rather than against, the structure's thermal properties. Native American peoples across the Great Plains developed similar technologies independently. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes built earth lodges, circular structures with wooden frames covered in layers of willow branches, grass, and earth. These dwellings, ranging from 30 to 60 feet in diameter, housed extended families through brutal plains winters using minimal fuel. The thermal mass principle was the same. Earth stores heat slowly and releases it gradually, creating stable interior temperatures. The Pawnee Earth Lodge design, documented by anthropologists in the late 1800s, showed remarkable sophistication. 4 central posts supported a domed roof structure covered with progressively smaller timbers arranged in a spiral pattern. Over this frame went layers of willow branches, prairie grass, and finally earth, totaling 12 to 18 inches of insulation and thermal mass. A central fire pit, positioned precisely beneath a smoke hole, provided heating with extraordinary efficiency. In Scandinavia, the GAM structures of the Sami people demonstrated similar principles adapted to Arctic conditions. Partially underground, heavily insulated with earth and turf, these dwellings maintained livable temperatures even when exterior cold reached 40 below zero. The Sami had refined these designs over millennia, proving that human comfort in extreme cold didn't require modern technology. It required understanding thermal physics and working intelligently with available materials. What unified all these traditions was a recognition that modern industrial housing seemed to have forgotten. Thermal mass matters more than insulation alone. A thin, highly insulated wall might slow heat transfer, but it doesn't store warmth. When the heat source stops, temperature drops rapidly. A thick earthen wall, by contrast, absorbs heat during the day or when fires burn, then radiates that warmth back into the living space for hours afterward. Ericsson understood this intuitively, not through formal engineering education, but through lived experience in Norwegian turf houses and careful observation of how materials behaved. His ignorant design actually incorporated principles that wouldn't be formally studied in American architectural schools until the mid-20th century, when researchers began investigating passive solar design and thermal mass strategies. By 1885, the Montana Territory turf shelters had proven their durability as well as their efficiency. Ericsson's original structure showed no structural degradation after 6 years of continuous occupation. The sod walls had knit together so completely that they formed what appeared to be solid earthen masses, impervious to moisture infiltration and remarkably resistant to settling. The grass-covered roof had actually improved over time, with native prairie plants establishing deep root systems that prevented erosion while adding insulation. Thomas Bradley's detailed documentation allowed researchers decades later to calculate the thermal performance of these structures with precision. A properly constructed turf shelter in Montana's climate, they determined, maintained interior temperatures within a 15-degree range year-round using minimal external energy input. Summer cooling and winter heating requirements were reduced by approximately 70 to 80% compared to conventional wood frame structures of equivalent size. But the legacy extended beyond thermal performance. The turf shelter tradition influenced Montana frontier architecture in subtle ways that persisted long after most settlers had returned to above-ground construction. The practice of berming earth against north-facing walls became standard. Root cellars, once considered optional storage spaces, became integral design elements as settlers recognized the benefits of earth-coupled temperature stability. Even modern Montana homes often incorporate partial underground construction, walkout basements, earth-sheltered garages, echoing principles that Ericsson demonstrated in 1878. The cultural legacy was equally significant. The rapid acceptance of earth shelter construction in late 1870s Montana represented a rare moment when practical results overcame cultural prejudice quickly and decisively. Within 18 months, living underground had transformed from a mark of poverty or desperation into evidence of engineering sophistication. This shift reflected something fundamental about frontier pragmatism. When survival depended on results rather than appearances, when fuel scarcity made efficiency a matter of life and death, settlers proved willing to abandon inherited assumptions and embrace unfamiliar technologies, even technologies that challenged their sense of dignity or social standing. That willingness to learn from disparate cultural traditions, Norwegian turf houses, Native American earth lodges, Icelandic torfbear, represented frontier America at its most adaptive. Ericsson's shelter succeeded not just because his engineering was sound, but because Montana settlers, once convinced by evidence, could acknowledge that primitive techniques sometimes contained wisdom that civilized methods had lost. The irony, of course, is that modern construction has largely forgotten these lessons. Contemporary American homes rely on massive energy inputs to maintain comfort, fighting constantly against exterior temperatures rather than working with thermal stability. We've replaced 7 tons of free thermal mass with expensive HVAC systems, trading fuel efficiency for convenience and cultural familiarity. Ericsson's shelter stands as a reminder that engineering progress isn't always linear. Sometimes the most advanced solution looks remarkably like ancient wisdom, proven and refined over generations of human experience. Walk into a typical modern American home during winter, and you'll find a familiar pattern. The thermostat clicks on. The furnace roars to life. Hot air blasts through vents. The temperature climbs from 65 to 70 degrees. Then the thermostat clicks off. Within 30 minutes, the temperature has dropped back to 67 degrees. The cycle repeats hour after hour, consuming energy constantly while achieving only modest temperature stability. Now compare that to Lars Ericsson's turf shelter. Small fire burns for 2 hours. Temperature rises from 50 to 58 degrees. Fire dies. 12 hours later, temperature has dropped to 52 degrees. No mechanical systems. No thermostats. No fossil fuel dependency. Just thermal mass doing what thermal mass does, storing heat and releasing it slowly. The difference isn't about primitive versus advanced. It's about 2 fundamentally different approaches to thermal management. Modern homes prioritize active heating, constantly adding energy to compensate for rapid heat loss. Turf shelters prioritized passive heating, storing energy in thermal mass to minimize the need for constant input. The numbers tell the story starkly. A typical 1,500 square foot modern wood frame house in Montana might consume 800 to 1,200 therms of natural gas per year for heating, equivalent to roughly 24,000 to 36,000 pounds of firewood. Ericsson's 192 square foot turf shelter consumed approximately 15,000 pounds of firewood per year. Per square foot heating requirements were actually lower in the turf shelter despite its minimal technology. How is this possible? The modern home has insulation, double-pane windows, sophisticated building materials, advantages Ericsson never imagined. Yet his design achieved better thermal efficiency. The explanation lies in what modern construction lacks: substantial thermal mass. Most modern homes contain perhaps 500 to 1,000 pounds of thermally significant mass: drywall, concrete foundation, maybe some tile or brick facing. Ericsson's shelter contained 14,000 pounds of thermal mass in the walls and roof alone. That's 14 to 28 times more heat storage capacity in a structure 1/8 the size. This mass differential creates fundamentally different thermal behaviors. In a modern home, heat escapes rapidly through walls, windows, and roof despite insulation. The structure itself stores almost no energy. When heating stops, temperature drops quickly. In the turf shelter, the earthen walls absorbed heat and released it over 12 to 16 hours. The structure itself was the heating system, with the fire serving merely to recharge it periodically. Modern passive solar design has rediscovered these principles, often unknowingly recreating what frontier turf shelters demonstrated 150 years ago. High-performance homes now incorporate massive interior walls, concrete, adobe, stone, to store solar heat during the day and release it at night. They use earth coupling, positioning structures partially underground to take advantage of stable ground temperatures. They minimize thermal bridging and air infiltration, principles Ericsson's entrance tunnel design addressed instinctively. The most advanced modern earth-sheltered homes, structures built into hillsides with bermed walls and green roofs, look remarkably similar to Ericsson's 1878 design. They achieve heating reductions of 70 to 80% compared to conventional construction, nearly identical to the performance frontier turf shelters demonstrated. The techniques have been rediscovered and marketed as cutting-edge innovation, but they're actually ancient wisdom filtered through contemporary building codes and modern materials. Could you build a turf shelter today and live comfortably? Absolutely. In fact, several modern homesteaders have done exactly that, documenting the process online. They report interior temperatures in the 50 to 60 degree range year-round, with minimal heating input, precisely matching what Ericsson achieved in 1878. Some incorporate solar panels for lighting and electronics, but the fundamental thermal system remains unchanged. Massive earthen walls coupled to stable ground temperatures, with small supplemental heat sources as needed. The regulatory challenges are more significant than the technical ones. Modern building codes in most jurisdictions don't accommodate underground construction easily. Inspectors trained on conventional framing methods often lack frameworks for evaluating earth shelter designs. Mortgage lenders struggle to assess value for structures that don't fit standard residential categories. Cultural bias against living underground persists despite engineering evidence. Yet for off-grid homesteaders, for those pursuing genuine energy independence, for anyone interested in resilient low-tech systems, the turf shelter model offers proven solutions. It's not romantic or primitive. It's physics, thermal mass, earth coupling, strategic design, and minimal energy input, achieving maximum comfort. The lessons extend beyond extreme off-grid scenarios. Even conventional homeowners can apply turf shelter principles. Adding thermal mass to interior spaces, tile floors, stone walls, concrete counters, increases heat storage. Forming earth against north-facing walls reduces heat loss. Positioning structures partially below grade takes advantage of ground temperature stability. Using smaller, more efficient heat sources rather than oversized systems reduces fuel consumption. If you're serious about energy independence, about genuine resilience, about understanding how to maintain comfort with minimal resources, hit that like button and subscribe right now. This knowledge isn't just historical curiosity. It's practical engineering that works just as well today as it did in 1878. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and whether you trust your life to thermal mass and earth coupling or conventional HVAC systems in a long-term grid-down scenario. Lars Ericsson died in 1903 at age 71. He lived in his original turf shelter until 1895, when he finally built a conventional wood frame house. Not because the shelter failed, but because his children preferred above-ground living. The turf shelter stood abandoned for another 33 years before finally collapsing in 1928, 50 years after construction. Its legacy, however, proved far more durable than the structure itself. Thomas Bradley's detailed documentation preserved the design principles. Dozens of families across Montana Territory had built their own versions, passing the knowledge to the next generation. And when researchers in the 1970s began investigating energy-efficient construction, they found themselves rediscovering techniques that Norwegian immigrants and frontier settlers had proven a century earlier. The man they called a fool for digging into the earth had actually been an engineer working at the highest level, using minimal resources to achieve maximum results, understanding thermal physics intuitively, and proving that ancient wisdom often contains truths that modern convenience has obscured. In the end, Ericsson's shelter stood as proof of a principle that goes far beyond construction. Dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. The ancestors who survived impossible conditions without modern technology weren't lucky or desperate. They were sophisticated engineers who understood their materials and environment in ways we're only beginning to recover. 7 tons of earth, 6 feet underground, 58 degrees of comfort in Montana's deadliest winter. Sometimes the most advanced solution is also the oldest one.